Hi, Junior Church kids. Welcome to today's virtual Junior Church. I'm glad you're here watching with me. Today, first of all, today's Father's Day if you're watching this on Sunday, so I hope you said Happy Father's Day to your dad, and I hope you're making him feel very special today. And today we're going to continue going through the book of Joshua. Last week we talked about Ai and the battle there, and how at first they couldn't win because Achan had lied to God and stolen and kept some of the devoted things. But then once they got that settled and taken care of, then they were able to go and defeat Ai. So now last week was Joshua chapter 7 and 8, and then today is the rest of chapter 8. So we didn't actually go through the whole chapter of chapter 8 last week. We're doing the rest of chapter 8 today, and then all of chapter 9 of the book of Joshua. So that's where we're going to be looking at today. And it starts out at the end of chapter 8 with now that they've defeated Jericho and they've defeated Ai, they are ready to do what God had commanded them back in the book of Deuteronomy, to redo the law and re-say the law. And remember how at the foot of Mount Ebal and Mount I gotta look at my note, Gerizim, I want to make sure I say those right. So Mount Gerizim was on the west and Mount Ebal was on the east. And if you look, they were a mile apart. But if you remember, the Israelites had probably 1 or 2 million people with all the women and children and everybody. So they probably needed that big of an area to hold everybody. So they all gathered there. And in the middle, in between the two mountains, they had the Ark of the Covenant, which, if you remember, was a special box with the angels on top with their wings touching. It was all made of gold that held inside of it the 10 Commandments. It held Aaron's staff that had budded the almond blossoms and the almonds, and also some manna from the desert. So those 3 things were in there, but then it was all covered up, and usually a blue cloth was over it. So the pictures that are shown, I think one of the pictures shows the Ark of the Covenant just out, and that probably wasn't the case because nobody was supposed to look at it because it was so special. It was supposed to represent God's presence and was so holy, so set apart that they needed to remember that they couldn't even look on God because God is so amazing. So the Ark of the Covenant, though, was held by the priest, because you remember the only way it could be transported and moved around was by the priest carrying it on the poles. The priest couldn't even touch the Ark of the Covenant because it was so special. But they held it on the poles in the middle, in between Mount Gerizim and the Mount Ebal. And then around them, on both sides of them, facing the Ark of the Covenant, was all the Israelites. And if you remember back in Deuteronomy, we talked about how God had commanded 6 specific tribes to be on Mount Gerizim and 6 specific tribes to be on Mount Ebal. I don't remember which ones were which, but they all gathered where they're supposed to, and they faced the Ark of the Covenant, and they faced Joshua. And then Joshua made an altar to God, and God gave him specific directions to make sure he didn't use any tools to even cut the stones, because it needed to not be tampered in any way. It needed to be God's natural stone. So he found some really nice stones that fit together well, and he made an altar to God. And then then Joshua wrote out all the laws that God had given, and that would have been all of the first 5 books of the Bible that we went through, which were Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And that's that much of my Bible. Now, that doesn't look like a huge chunk, but if you remember how small our writing is in our Bibles, that's quite a few words that Joshua would have had to write out for all the Israelites to see. And so he wrote out all the law, and then he read it to them, and all the Israelites stood there and listened to it and remembered God's promises. And then if you remember God's directions, they said I can't remember which mountain was which, but one of the mountains they said the blessings, and the other mountain they said the curses. And it would have been great acoustics there because of the way the mountains were in that valley. And so they could hear everything that was said, and all 1 or 2 million people would have been able to hear all of God's laws and remember God's promises that God had fulfilled over the past few weeks while they'd had all these amazing battles. So that's a really neat thing that they did first to start off their time in the Promised Land, is to remember God's laws like we need to do, and to remember all God had done for them. So, and another special thing that, most of the time, like with the people that are going to battle and the people that are in charge of things are usually men in the Bible. However, included in the group of people that listened to all the laws that Joshua said, the Bible specifically says that all the men and women and children were there listening to the law, and even the foreigners, the people that weren't part of Israel. So that means God thought it was important for you kids to hear his words. And it was also important, and it's a good thing to remember today, because some people think that the Old Testament doesn't matter because we're not Jews. At least most of us aren't Jews, at our church. And so the Old Testament is more for Jewish people, not for people that just follow Jesus later. But that's not true, because God even includes the foreigners, the people that weren't Jews, and the people that weren't Israelites in to hear the laws. And he thought it was important for them to hear too. So I thought that was a good thing for you to know about, that God includes the foreigners in that the reading of the law that Joshua did for the people. So that's part 1 of our story. And then part 2 is chapter 9. Now, if you remember, they're going through and they're conquering all the towns in Israel because God had given them this promised land. And I know that sounds really bad to just go in and destroy cities, but if you remember, I've mentioned before, but I want to remind you that these towns had gotten very, very evil. They were worshiping false gods. They were doing terrible, terrible things. I don't even want to tell you how terrible things, because I don't want to give you nightmares, but it was really, really bad. And God knew that if he let them live, then they might make it harder for the Israelites to follow him, because they'd get tempted to do those bad things. And so God said, those people have gotten so far away from me that you need to just go in and wipe them out. This is your promised land I've given you. And that was their directions. They weren't supposed to make any treaties. They were just supposed to go through and wipe everybody out. Now, some of the towns, if you look there at the map, it shows the town there, says Gilgal. That is kind of the area where Israel set up camp. When they first came across the Jordan River, that was where Joshua made the altar with the 10 stones that the 10 leaders from the tribes of Israel had piled up to remember that God helped them cross the Jordan River. And after they made that was kind of like their base camp from that point forward for a while. And that's where, like, when they went out to fight Jericho, they went from Gilgal to Jericho, and then they went from Gilgal to Ai in last week's story. But they stayed in Gilgal because the women and children didn't have to pack up to go to battle, just the men did. And it was just easier not to have to move around so much. So they were there in Gilgal, but the people on the west side, the west side of the country were starting to hear about all the battles, and all the kings of the different country. In fact, I'm going to read all the kings the Bible mentioned, and you'll see there on the west side of the map, they're all listed there. The kings of the Hittites, the kings of the Amorites, the kings of the Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. They all started getting together and getting ready for battle because they knew Israel was coming towards them and was going to be attacking them. So they were preparing. But if you look, last week we talked about Ai. The next city over is a city called Gibeon. And in Gibeon, instead of getting ready to fight, they decided they would try to trick Israel. And so what they did is they got a plan together. They all gathered together and said, what can we do? And they said, we are going to try to trick them and think we're from a long way away, that we're not even from this area. So they're not going to make them think they don't want to attack us because we're so far away. And we'll come and we'll wear really old clothes that are worn out. And we'll take old, stale, moldy food. And we'll take really old, cracked wineskin flasks that are all torn and patched back up. And we'll make them think we traveled a long way to get there. When really, it only took like a day to get from Gibeon to Gilgal. So that's what they did. The people of Gibeon got all their old clothes and all worn out. They had sandals that had been torn and then patched back up, and they just looked really pathetic. And they got all these, and they came to Israel, and Joshua and the other leaders met them and said, hi. And they said, hi, we are from a long way off, but we've heard how wonderful your God is and how strong you are, so we want to make a treaty with you. And Joshua and the Israelites say, wait a minute here. How do we know you're from a long way away? And they said, oh, we will show you. Look at our moldy bread here. This bread was still warm from the oven when we first left home, but now it's all gross and green and moldy and has things growing on it. That's how long we traveled, because it had all this time to go bad. And oh, look at our clothes. They were brand new clothes when we first left home, but now they're all worn out. And look at our wineskins. They were brand new, and now they're all cracking, and the wine's gotten really old because it's been so long. And Joshua and the Israelites like tasted some of the gross bread and looked at the different things, and they're like, oh wow, they must have really traveled a far way, and they just believed them. They never talked to God, because who do you think really knew how far the way they'd come? God did. And they never prayed to God and asked God's direction on this, but they just believed him. And so they made a treaty with the Gibeonites. And so they promised them, okay, we will not attack you, and if you have problems, we will help defend you. And so the Gibeonites said, okay, thank you, great, making a treaty with you, and they left. Well, then, shortly after that, Joshua and the Israelites found out that they just lived a little ways away. And so Joshua called them back and said, hey, why did you lie to us? And they said, we know how powerful your God is. We knew that you would come and destroy us, so we didn't want that to happen. So we knew if you promised us that you would not fight against us, that you would keep your promise. And they said, oh, we have to keep our promise, but because you were so sneaky, you are not going to be able to just be like a normal citizen or anything. You're going to have a consequence for this. You are going to be in charge of cutting our wood and carrying our water, and help us out with that as a way to make up for the bad things you did, the way you tricked us. And they said, okay, we can live with that. We'd rather be alive and cut your wood and carry your water. And so that's what they did. And in fact, in the end of Joshua 9, it says the Gibeonites are still to that day, are still the woodcutters and water carriers. And I don't know how long that stayed going and how long they survived after that, but at the end of chapter 9, that's what they still said. So that is the story. Oh, and Joshua did tell them too, because they had lied to them and deceived them that way, that they were cursed from God because they weren't being honest with them. So that's not a very good thing either. But so we're going to find out more about that next week in the Gibeonites and something else that happened with them. But that's the end of today's story. So enjoy one more song, and then I will come back and we'll talk about what we learned today.